We have Kat and someone who will with me today. We also have Kat and Samuel who will also be moderating the other panels, and Eric who will be taking care of the technical aspect of this webinar. We would like to, of course, thank our brilliant speakers who have accepted our invitation to provide an insight on today's topics on renewable energy, sustainable development, and pollinators. We have also received a couple of questions from the participants, which we will ask to our speakers, obviously, if we have enough time left. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Malta's Minister for Environment, Energy and Enterprise, Dr. Miriam Dalli. For everyone's information, the session will continue until 5:30 with Dr. Dalli, and then we will start the next panel on sustainable development. And finally, we have the final panel about pollinators at 6 p.m. Okay, Dr. Dalli, first of all, thank you very, very much for accepting our invitation and for your cooperation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We truly appreciate it. This webinar will be obviously recorded for everyone else who is listening. This was a request also by the European Commission since it's a Europe-wide event. So first question, Dr. Dalli, you have an extremely vast, new and important portfolio, and especially in today's day and age, right? And during this webinar, in this section, we will be focusing particularly on the energy aspect of your political responsibilities. Therefore, I was wondering whether you could provide us with a brief outline of what your main priorities are for the Maltese Islands in terms of energy policy and development of alternative energy sources.
First of all, please call me Miriam. I prefer it. Let's start off with the topic that we're dealing with. So we're speaking primarily in the context of the fact that the European Union is currently pushing for the Green Deal and also negotiating the Fit for 55 package. I'm speaking primarily about this because before I became minister, and initially that was around a year and a half ago. And initially I was responsible for energy, enterprise and sustainable development. Now, following the general election, I have a bigger portfolio and it's focusing on environment, energy and enterprise. And within the remit of my portfolio, there is sustainable development as well. But before becoming Minister for Malta, I was a member of the European Parliament. I was Vice President for the Socialists and Democrats, and I was one of the Parliament's negotiators for the Green Deal. So I look at the Green Deal as our roadmap to arrive towards carbon neutrality by 2050. And when we speak about carbon neutrality by 2050, it does entail a lot of challenges, but I believe there is a lot of opportunities that we can tap into. And one of the sectors where the Green Deal provides us with challenges, but also with opportunities, is primarily the energy sector. And I look at this from the EU-wide perspective, but also from the perspective of an island member state like Malta. And I'm emphasizing the island member state aspect because it puts us in a bit of a different situation than other mainland EU countries. We have different realities because we are not connected, for example, to the gas grid of the European Union. And that takes also a pronounced impact in this current scenario. And this becomes even more pronounced than it was before. But also from the fact that as an island member state, we have moved away from coal as a source of energy generation, from heavy fuel oil as a source of energy generation. And we are primarily at this point in time having LNG as our source of energy production. That makes 66% of our energy sources. The other 33% comes mainly from the interconnector. But I am happy to say that we have been ramping up renewables, not as much as I would like, I have to admit that. So we need to work much more. But if I look at what we have today when it comes to renewables, we're speaking about 205 megawatts of renewables. Just to give you an idea, we have 2 power plants. One generates 200 megawatts of energy and another power plant that generates 150 megawatts of energy, and our interconnector has a capacity of 200 megawatts of energy. So when we're speaking about 205 megawatts of renewables, then we're speaking about like having another power plant.
Exactly.
The only issue is the problems that come with intermittency. So Malta is a small island member state. So I'm emphasizing the small because it gives the perspective also of the challenges we face. We're quite limited when it comes to land.
Exactly.
And we're surrounded by sea, and it's one of the areas where sea depth is quite a lot. So you have exactly the issue of bathymetry. I'm mentioning this because whilst other countries might tap into, for example, onshore wind, for Malta, unfortunately, that is not something that we can tap into. And some other countries can tap into offshore wind. For us, that is an issue because of the depth of the sea, we have to look at floating offshore technologies. This is something that we can speak about later on, why it is a challenge. But I was speaking about the intermittency issue. So I have the capacity of another power plant, 205 megawatts of renewables, which can give me energy when we have a nice weather, when it's sunny, because primarily we are currently dependent on solar panels. But the moment I have clouds, the moment I have bad weather, the moment the sun goes down, then I don't have that capacity anymore. So all of a sudden, you know, that 205 megawatts of energy is not existent anymore. And that puts us in a bit of an uncomfortable situation in the sense that obviously you need to have your backup plans. So we're also looking at innovative technologies, like when it comes to battery storage, because that can help me also store that energy that is produced, for example, during the day and use it at times where it is most convenient for us. So, you know, we're looking at all these different opportunities that can come with the Green Deal and hopefully also with the Fit for 55 package.
Exactly. Thank you very much for your answer. So next question actually connects to what you were saying. In fact, keeping in mind Malta's limitations, both in terms of natural resources, extremely limited land space. We need to also keep in mind that Malta's performance was less than optimal in these past years, especially when it comes to renewable energy sources. In fact, like you mentioned, Malta was only generating 10.7% of its energy from renewable energy sources. And why do you think this is so? And is it solely due to Malta's natural limitations, or do you think we could have prioritized this matter even more during these past years? And also, we have to keep in mind the Repower EU document that the Commission has also published. And how do you think we can change the future of the country in this regard?
It's good that you're mentioning the Repower EU communication. So I will make a reference to that as well. But just a little proviso, it's true that when you speak about 10.7% of energy coming from renewables, I have to be honest with you, it's not like, you know, a percentage that I'm so happy about. Obviously, there is so much more room for improvement, even if I had to compare with other EU member states. But I would like to make this proviso because the target that was agreed for Malta for the year 2020 was that of 10%. And that was done for a reason, not because, you know, someone decided to, so yes, let's give them just 10%. It's because of all these challenges that you were mentioning. So there is the issue of land space. It is still very limited. And then there is the issue also that I was mentioning earlier. So if we had to look at offshore renewables, what kind of offshore renewables we can adopt as a country. We're primarily looking as a country towards floating technology, so floating wind turbines. But with the full understanding that when you're speaking about floating wind turbines, we're speaking about innovative technology, which is so much more expensive than other technologies that currently exist. So if I had to compare, for example, a normal offshore wind turbine, which is not a floating one, compared, for example, to onshore wind turbines, it is calculated that the difference in price is that of 10 times as much more expensive when we're speaking about offshore wind turbines. That's not taking into consideration floating technology. That is even more expensive. We are cognizant of that fact. I'm mentioning this because we're still looking at that kind of technology, because ultimately we have to ramp up our renewables. We want to, as a country, move from fossil fuels to cleaner energy. Now, LNG is the cleanest of fossil fuels. It's true. But it's still a fossil fuel. So I would like to move my country towards cleaner sources of energy for a number of facts. It is cleaner, so it's better for the environment, less CO2 emissions, less greenhouse gas emissions, but also in this current scenario that we are currently living in, that would give me more independence as a country, rather than, depending on other countries from where I have to import, in this case, LNG or any other kind of fuel. So the more we manage as a country to ramp up our renewables, the more independent we can become. But when you want to plan for renewables, it's not something that will happen overnight either. So it takes time to plan, and it takes time to actually implement a project. But if everyone starts saying, but this will not happen in the next year or two, then no one starts the process. So I would like us to start ASAP. We're working on that because we're trying to look at all the different technologies that exist, what we can adopt in our country. And we set the ball rolling, because the earlier we set the ball rolling, the earlier we might see better results than what we currently have. That doesn't mean that we stop doing what we're currently doing. So in the last year, we managed to issue quite a strong capacity for renewables. The uptake wasn't as much as we wanted. So the market wasn't like, it didn't take all the capacity that we presented out there. But I'm sure that there is interest and the market will pick up in the years to come. Because when I speak also with different entrepreneurs and investors, both local and foreign, there is a lot of interest in this area, because they do understand that the whole of the European Union is going in that direction. Exactly. Now, you referred to the Repower EU communication. Yeah. Now, the Repower EU communication is obviously an answer to what is currently happening. But I found a communication which is quite interesting, and which, in my point of view, is also realizing that the European Union as a whole needs to invest even further when it comes to these innovative technologies, and also to hydrogen and hydrogen-ready infrastructure. And that is particularly interesting, because until a few months ago, I was getting the feeling that when we're speaking about hydrogen-ready infrastructure, there were some cold feet about it. But really and truly, if we want to go to cleaner energy, then we need to make sure that we tap into all the different sources.
Just to backtrack one bit, we had quite a lot of questions regarding, like you said, wind energy projects, right? And from the research we made, and from what we asked people, it became clear that the obstacles to invest in wind energy in Malta are huge. It's not easy. There's visibility issue, the depth of the sea is a problem. We have lack of space, and there's also possible dangers. But I know that there are examples abroad also where there are offshore wind energy projects. I believe in Scotland, if I'm not mistaken, they have a huge project. And I know that you are trying to diversify, but do you think realistically Malta will ever invest in that source, especially due to the necessity to reach a larger share in renewable energy targets. And I read about cross-border initiatives, and I would like to ask whether they have been considered possibly in joint public procurement of offshore floating technology.
So the very simple answer to your first question is irrelevant if we want or not, we have to. So if I want my country to be in a situation where we can produce more energy from renewables, then I don't have a lot of options. I need to look in particular at offshore technologies. Now, the most predominant technology at this point in time is offshore wind, and there is also offshore solar as well. So we're at a point where we're looking at all the different options, and we're not in a position to like close any doors, because there is a limit how much we can expand as a country when it comes to onshore solar panels. I still believe there is room for improvement, mind you. So I do not agree if someone comes and tells me, no, we reached the capacity that we have when it comes to onshore solar. I still believe that there is room for improvement when it comes to onshore solar. But I'm also aware of the fact that with onshore solar alone, my country will never be in a position to actually reach the targets that ultimately we want to reach. I'm saying this because as a country, we took also the commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050. That means that we need to have a decarbonized economy. Now, it's true that when we're speaking about carbon neutrality, we're speaking about net neutrality. So you can have eventually other technologies like carbon capture storage. But really and truly, in a country like ours, we need to make sure that we are clean as much as possible when it comes to the way our economy works. So we need to ramp up to have a decarbonized economy. That will not happen only by focusing on the energy sector alone, but I believe that the energy sector can, make a lot of difference. You had another question, which I'm not too sure whether I left out, to be honest.
I read about cross-border initiatives.
Cross-border initiatives, yes. At this point, we're looking at all the options. So that includes also the possibility of seeing if we can have initiatives that involve more than one member state or more than one country. Obviously, it all depends on the technical feasibility, the economic feasibility, and if it does make financial sense or not. But as I mentioned earlier, we're definitely not closing any doors to any possibilities.
And is there interest from other European member states or there is no indication yet whether they would be willing to create these joint initiatives?
I believe there will always be interest, but you need to take the discussions and the negotiations further to make sure that, something concretizes that actually makes then a real difference.
Thank you. Now back to Malta's National Energy and Climate Plan. One of Malta's main approaches to hydrogen deployment was through a pipeline project with Italy, right, to secure the country's energy supply. And in von der Leyen's words, during the launch of the REPowerEU also, she said that the quicker we switch to renewables and hydrogen combined with energy efficiency, the quicker we will master our energy system. Therefore, it's definitely wise that, like you said, Malta's plans also include hydrogen in its energy mix. However, Malta's MECP does not provide targets and specific policies and measures with regards to the use of gas. I read this in a report that I was reading published by FCHJU. And how does Malta plan to tap into the production of hydrogen, more specifically green hydrogen, in the coming years?
So let me be very clear. When we speak about hydrogen, what primarily interests me is green hydrogen. Definitely not gray hydrogen, not particularly interested in blue hydrogen because it requires technologies such as carbon capture and storage. So what I am primarily interested in vis-a-vis my country is green hydrogen. It's good to be aware as well that initially Malta was looking at a gas pipeline. But when we saw also the push towards climate neutrality by 2050, and the COP in Paris, for example, in my point of view, was a turning point, and all the push that was going in that direction, we believed that it would make more sense to actually go for a hydrogen-ready infrastructure, because we do not want to ultimately end up with any stranded assets. To have a hydrogen-ready infrastructure and to be able to transport hydrogen, we need to also assess when there will be enough supply of hydrogen around us. Because if we're speaking about green hydrogen, then that has to be produced from excess renewables as well. So what we're currently doing at the moment, I'm saying this because you made the reference to the NECP.
Exactly.
So this change to go towards a hydrogen-ready pipeline happened in the past year and a half. What we are currently doing is that we are testing and analyzing when we will have enough supply of hydrogen around us, because that would give us also visibility on when we can tap into hydrogen, and also to make sure that we will be connected with the rest of the EU to manage to tap into hydrogen. Given our very small size, it will be limited for us to actually, be producers of hydrogen in the amounts that we would actually require. So what we're looking also is at a mix of electrification and also the possibility to tap into hydrogen. Why I'm mentioning this? Because if we had to take, for example, transport. So you have passenger vehicles and also small commercial vehicles that can be best served, in my point of view, with electrification. But we all know that, for example, electrification for heavy-duty vehicles is much more of a headache. And that is where hydrogen, for example, can be a best fuel to clean also those kind of vehicles, the transport aspect. I want to make sure that my country can have the possibility to eventually tap into hydrogen, because if we are locked out from having such infrastructure, then unfortunately we'll be locked out from having really and truly a diversified mix that can help us reduce emissions.
Thank you. And we had one question also from the public. Maybe you could also explain, this participant asked why the government has proposed a new gas pipeline whilst the climate crisis demands an immediate halt in investment and use of fossil fuels. So we're speaking, I believe, about the gas pipeline that connects Malta to Italy and Sicily, right? She said we should be investing in renewables instead. Could you explain the importance of Malta's connection with the rest of the EU in this regard?
So just as a matter of clarification, it was initially a gas pipeline. We are presenting a hydrogen-ready pipeline, and all the studies that we're carrying out go in that direction, and also the studies that we will be looking at are looking at changing to a hydrogen-ready pipeline. As I mentioned earlier, I don't want us as a country to have a stranded asset in the form of a gas pipeline, but having a hydrogen-ready pipeline would give us the opportunity to eventually tap into hydrogen like the rest of the EU from what we're seeing, because the push is in that direction. But you mentioned a very important point now, the importance of being linked to the EU market.
Yes.
I think what we're going through now continues to emphasize that importance. So Monday, we had an urgent council meeting on the situation that we are facing when it comes to energy. The war in Ukraine is putting concerns on security of supply when it comes to the energy sector. I was listening also to other member states who were speaking about, when we will face a situation where we might end up with a threat that we will not have gas coming into our country. Everyone was speaking about the importance of solidarity, so that, one member state can help the other. And I had to speak about this point because it's true that the EU is based on solidarity. We speak a lot about solidarity. That solidarity needs to concretize itself, because in our case, as an island member state who is not connected to Europe's gas grid, but we are dependent on shipments of LNG, if something had to happen, like it could happen to any other member state, I can't turn on any other member state to get gas through a pipeline, for example. And that is because, unfortunately, as things stand today, we are not completely linked to the European Union when it comes to energy. It's true that we have one interconnector. It's true that we are looking at a second interconnector. But when it comes to other sources, then we are completely locked out. Which brings me to the point that you were mentioning. Why aren't we focusing more on renewables? One does not exclude the other. When we announced a second interconnector, to give us the possibility to ramp up more on renewables. Because if I have, and this links also to the intermittency issue that I mentioned earlier. So the moment those 205 megawatts of energy that are being produced by sun stop all of a sudden because, it's a rainy day, it's night, there are clouds. If I don't have the interconnector, that means that I would need to switch on a power plant. And that takes around 30 minutes. That means, that you'll have that issue of 30 minutes leaving people without electricity. Whereas if I would have an interconnector, the moment those 205 megawatts are not there anymore, you can switch to the interconnector straight away, and consumers would not even realize that there was that switch. So the more I have a strong energy grid, the stronger my energy grid, the more I can ramp up on renewables. And having better the security, but also it gives me more peace of mind, because the more than renewables I have, I know that I can have an interconnector which can also address that intermittency issue. So one does not exclude the other completely. We as an island believe primarily in having a mix and diversified sources, because that can give you the possibility to go from one thing to the other if you have an issue with one particular source of energy.
We just received one question to ask whether the hydrogen-ready pipeline would mean that it will first transport natural gas and then be switched to do a hydrogen pipeline, or whether it will start transporting hydrogen immediately upon its creation, really.
It all depends on what supply would be available around us. Now, if we are speaking a hydrogen-ready pipeline, this will not happen in a year or two. It takes at least 5 years to have in place. I'm mentioning this because from the push I'm seeing from the European Union, I'm assuming that in the years to come, we will see a bigger push to actually make sure that the EU produces more hydrogen. We are speaking about a hydrogen-ready pipeline because if the sources around us can't transport 100% of hydrogen from day one, then we need to have that possibility of having a mix between hydrogen and gas until we arrive in a situation where we can transport 100% hydrogen.
Thank you for your reply. Now let's switch on a bit to solar. Like you were saying, Malta has an immense potential when it comes to solar energy production. And I cannot not ask this question because obviously we also received quite a number of questions in this regard. Regarding the increase in apartment blocks, which are creating difficulties for apartment owners to actually own PV panels, and many still don't have the opportunity to use the sun's benefits freely. is there a plan to possibly resolve the issue, and in addition, obviously, to a boost in investments by private individuals in this renewable energy resource? There's also an issue where we have individuals who have PV panels, for example, on roofs, which are being overshadowed by multi-story buildings. I was wondering whether, for the sake of the participants, whether there's a plan in this regard to possibly mitigate this problem.
So let me try and divide the issue on different
Yes.
aspects. So first, people who do not have access to their to a roof because they live in a block of apartments, and how they can actually tap into renewables.
Solar energy, yes.
Exactly. So we're trying to devise a scheme to actually try and see whether there are people who do not have access to the roof, but who are interested in actually investing in solar panels or in onshore renewables, solar renewables. So that is in the pipeline, and we're trying to work on something like that to try and give the opportunity to people to go in that direction. But what you're mentioning goes also on another aspect of the issue as well. So if I have a building and someone, for example, next to me is building, I invested in solar panels, and now all of a sudden they are shadowed by the building adjacent to mine. So we are working on some solutions that we hope can, address the issue. Though I have to be very honest with you, it is a bit of a complex issue because all of a sudden you enter into the property rights of one and the other. So any solution that can go in this direction would need to take care of the rights of both the person whose house is being shadowed, but also the property rights of the other person who is building. So we're trying to look a bit towards possible solutions that can solve the issue rather than solve one's issue, but then impinge on the rights of the others. So it is a complex issue. I agree with you. There is a lot. There are a lot of people who invested in solar energy, and then all of a sudden you're not reaping the benefits of what you invested in. We're aware of that, and we're trying to see if there are working on possible solutions that can at least start addressing some of these issues.
Thank you. Also, to go back, because we also had a question from participants about this, regarding the Ukraine-Russia issue. They asked whether Russia's invasion of Ukraine would impact Malta in the manner of increase in prices of essential commodities, especially since it is an unprecedented situation.
It impacts everything. So the invasion of Ukraine from Russia obviously had an impact on the markets and primarily on the energy market. So initially I was saying that we have the plants that depend on LNG, and we depend on shipments of LNG, but we have also the interconnector. When we're speaking about the interconnector, we're importing electricity from Italy. And that is impacted also by the war in Ukraine. If you had to see, I have an app because every single day I try and look at the prices all across the European Union. And unfortunately, every single day that I look at this map, I see a lot of red everywhere. So the red means, that you have very high prices everywhere. Since we're importing from Italy, I also look all the time at the prices in Italy. And Italy is one of the worst hit countries when it comes to prices by what is going on at the moment in Ukraine and the invasion of Russia. So there, obviously, you have an impact straight away, and it is a direct impact. But even you start seeing that there is an impact, for example, on the price of Brent, on the price of different fuels, on the price of gas itself. Exactly. So obviously it has an impact, even though as a country we do not directly import LNG or gas or fuels from Russia, the impact is still there. It's there in the energy sector. it's there when it comes to food imports, when it comes to cereals. It's there when it comes to freight, particularly when we're speaking about ship transportation. So until yesterday, I was speaking with a number of enterprises in Malta. Malta being, again, an island member state, we have to import most of our things, and we have to import them primarily via ship transportation. We were speaking about the cost, for example, of containers. Just a few months ago, we're speaking about something in the region of 4,000 euros. Now, all of a sudden, we're speaking about something in the region of 20,000 euros. And that has an impact on prices across the board. The government, the Maltese government, took a conscious decision to try and keep energy prices as low as possible, in the sense that we are trying not to continue putting pressure on consumers because they are already facing disproportionate pressures when compared to what was happening just a few months ago.
Yeah.
You're seeing the kids going by.
Okay, don't worry about it. We're very used to it. It happens all the time. It's the norm. Last few questions, more related to you. So since this event is being organized by YES-Europe Malta, which is a youth-led organization, together with YES-Europe International, which is the wider umbrella organization, together with the Green Track, the commission's campaign with youths. I was wondering whether you think that we are doing enough, especially in the education sector, to raise awareness about climate change and how climate change is indirectly influenced by fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions. And do you think that this should be mandatory learning, especially for primary and secondary school students? I know this is not technically your area, education, however, and truly it's linked.
It is a topic close to my heart, because I remember I was still in the European Parliament and I wanted to see a situation where climate change is being taught in schools,
Exactly.
You know, not as an optional topic that kids might or might not choose, but as something which is mandatory.
That's mandatory, exactly.
Also, to be very honest with you, I don't like to see climate change as part of another topic. So it's like an add-on in another subject, but I think it merits to be a subject on its own. Because when we're speaking about climate change, we're not only speaking about energy, we're not only speaking about CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. We're speaking about a lot of different aspects. So we're speaking about biodiversity. We're speaking about changes in our geography. Because if we're speaking about what will happen to low-lying islands, and then we're speaking about, you know, a situation that affects geography itself, that affects societies. We're speaking about desertification. And I believe that all this merits a topic on its own. So if you had to ask me, are we doing enough? I believe that no one is doing enough. And, you know, there's always room for improvement, but I would like us to do much more than what we're currently doing. Because you mentioned young children and you mentioned youth. And I think those are the agents of change. So yes, when, you know, I speak to someone who is already set in his or her ideas, it is more difficult to push change, because all of a sudden you will have all these, like, you know, barriers, but you can't do this and you can't do that. Whereas young children and youth have like this freedom of actually trying to think of how we can change things. And yes, you know, you might not be in a situation to implement 100% of what they're saying, but their innovative ideas and their innovative way of thinking can give us scope to start analyzing things a bit more deeper and actually come up with some solutions which are different than what we have implemented so far.
We also received a question regarding funding for people in Malta who would like to venture out into the energy sector, like solar and wind and e-mobility and research and development. This person asked, how can we start a business to be able to push forward renewable energy systems? I believe that we need to push forward more to be able to create cheaper solutions in e-mobility and renewable energy systems. So I was wondering whether you know how Malta can help.
Definitely. I'm responsible of enterprise, and that includes also Malta Enterprise. Malta Enterprise is the agency of the government that creates schemes, but also attracts foreign direct investment, and we create also an ecosystem when it comes to attracting different investment. And one of the main things that we're primarily focusing on is startups. So we are providing amongst the most ambitious funding when it comes to startups. And I'm really, really glad that this question cropped up, because it gives me the opportunity to give visibility to this as well. Because when compared also to other EU countries, we're providing grants and also loans at a very, very low rate when it comes to startups to actually, set shop in Malta and promote their ideas. Until a week ago, I think, we launched also the first Accelerator program in Malta through Plug and Play, which will provide mentorship, but which can also provide access to capital for new investors. And we're particularly interested in looking at enterprises that are looking at digitalization and sustainability. And that also includes innovative ideas when it comes to energy, particularly when it comes to renewables and the clean energy sector. And those of you who are really interested in this, if they look up also on online through Malta Enterprise, there is a particular website that focuses on startups. It's called Start in Malta, where you can see all the different schemes and all the different ideas that one can actually tap into.
Thank you very, very much for that. One final question: what current or future initiatives can improve awareness, and how can youth action help keep political attention high on the government's agenda when it comes to transitioning away from fossil fuels to more sustainable energy resources? And you could state your answer as a final remark, if you will.
I think we need to keep the communication going. So policymakers, usually I say businesses, entrepreneurs, because they also are interested in actually investing in new technologies and coming up with new products, but primarily youth. Because if we keep that communication going, I think you as youth will be keeping up the pressure when it comes to certain policies that you want to see actually implemented. And discussing together policymakers and youth, I believe, new solutions and innovative solutions to traditional problems. Because really and truly, we have a lot of challenges that have been ongoing for a number of years. And it is amply clear, at least in my mind, that the traditional solutions did not work or did not work enough. So we really need to sit down together, come up with innovative ideas, try them out and see if they can actually, be the new solution for these old challenges that we have been facing as a country, as a continent, and as a world, because some of these challenges transcend continents, and they are common from one country to the other.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. You are more than welcome to stay on, but we know how busy you must be. And now
Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Anytime. I will pass on the lead to Samuel, who will be moderating the Sustainable Development panel. Samuel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Dr. Miriam Dalli. We will now be jumping on the topic of sustainability, which has in recent years become quite a hot topic for Malta, especially. However, I won't be going deep into what sustainability is, as I will let our speakers do so. With us today, we have Professor Alex Torpiano, Dean of the Faculty of the Built Environment at the University of Malta. And we also have Ms. Karen Sherry, who is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Climate Change and Sustainable Development, also with the University of Malta. Welcome to you both, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So our first question is this. We've been hearing a lot about sustainable development in recent years. However, the misconception is that this simply means that we must take a step back from destroying our natural environment to make way for more infrastructure. However, sustainable development means more than that, in the sense that even the urban environment around us must incorporate sustainable and eco-friendly practices to improve its environmental impact through urban planning and management. So with that said, my first question is this: do you think that this is possible for multi-cities, and if so, how?
Okay, am I meant to start first?
You can start.
Okay, I think we should first of all get the scale right. I mean, when we talk about multi-cities and sustainable cities, we really ought to be talking of the whole region of Malta, because Malta is a city-state, and it's difficult and sometimes dangerous to make comparisons with what is happening with, let's call it cities, real cities abroad, because in Malta, for example, we might be misled to think that cities are only the zones which are either already developed, urbanized, or else earmarked for development. And the rest, what we call outside development zone, is rural. In particular, let me give you an example. When we talk about sustainable mobility in cities, as is understood, say, in Rome or in Paris, in Malta, we have to think about sustainable mobility for the whole of Malta. It doesn't make sense to talk about sustainable mobility for Valletta or even for Slema. So the statement that, sorry about this, I should have found this, switch this off. So the statement that sustainable development is more than just preserving our natural environment is 100% right. We have to look at the whole region of Malta and Gozo. So your question is, can we have sustainable development in Malta? And as you say, can it incorporate sustainable and eco-friendly practices? And you go on to say, through urban planning and management. Now, I'm personally very suspicious of catchphrases like sustainable and eco-friendly, because, not because they're the wrong concept, but because I think they have proved to be a bit too elastic, and people have stretched their meaning to whatever they want. If we focus about sustainable, so sustainable should simply mean a question that we ask ourselves, whether we can continue to do what we are doing without any negative repercussions, especially, and this is one of the concepts of sustainable in the terms of future generations, especially on our children and their children. In other words, leaving space for the future. And I think it doesn't require, it doesn't require to be a professor to say that if we keep on doing what we have been doing over the last, let's say, half century, and at the same rate, I think we are going to run into serious problems. So to me, that is what sustainable development is about, pacing ourselves. And I'll come back to this issue later on if I have the opportunity. When I say, of course, problems, I don't mean only aesthetic or nostalgic problems. I'm a president of the Untitled, but I don't see my role as simply because we are fond of old buildings. But I see it as a risk from, risk to solid socioeconomic well-being. And again, if I have time, I can explain, for example, the impact of this on our tourism industry if our country continues to develop at the rate that it is. Your question asks whether it is possible for Malta to embrace sustainable development. And my answer is that it's not a question of whether it is possible or not. It's a question that we must embrace a more sustainable model because we cannot afford not to. You also ask whether we are heading in the right direction. And I'm sorry to say, my answer is no, at least not in the context of what I'm saying, this overall vision of sustainable development. I don't think we are seeing the complexity of the problem, and we are happy to focus on the shorter term and the narrower issues. For example, okay, we need to focus on making our buildings more energy efficient. And yes, You may build buildings using materials which are more recyclable and require less energy to produce. But the bigger question is, do we need to build so much building in the first place? In other words, it's a much more important question that we have to ask than simply whether we're talking about an energy efficient construction or a recyclable building material. I would just like to emphasize something I've said recently many times, but I didn't invent it. You find it in an important text. Real zero carbon development equates to zero development. So if we talk about real zero carbon, we must have no development. That is, of course, difficult because there are buildings that we need. There is some degree of development that we need. The next best would then be to use your existing building stock. And there's a very simple reason. It's not a question of nostalgia because the buildings are nicer, etc., or they have a history. It's because intrinsically, the buildings that we have built have a lot of energy embodied in them, embodied in the production of those materials, embodied in the efforts taken to build this material. When we demolish, we throw away that embodied energy. So it's already the act of demolishing buildings is already an energy wasteful approach. Of course, and the third level then is where we say, okay, but we do need to build these buildings, okay? So if we need to build, what we build has to have energy efficiency and green materials and recyclable concepts, etc. But we must not lose sight of the fact that we cannot just keep on building, even if we change to the most efficient energy production, even if we change the most recyclable materials in our construction industry. If we keep on building at the way we're building, at the rate we're building, then we're still not sustainable. The pace is not sustainable.
Thank you, Professor Torpiano. Now I give the floor to Karen.
Yes, I completely agree with Professor Torpiano's points. I think it is not something that we have to see if we can do, but it is something that we have to strive for. We have the upcoming goals in 2030 that we need to reach, and 2030 is not that far away, so we have to start putting it into practice. I think when it comes to sustainability within transport, but particularly it is a really pressing issue in the Maltese Islands because we have high greenhouse gas emissions stemming from motorized transport. So this is something that we also see in other urban areas around the world, that they lack a sustainable transport system, and the infrastructure unfortunately continues to then encourage private car use. So I would say even the COVID-19 pandemic, it really showed us how important it is to create livable and resilient urban spaces that are not only compact and sustainable, but also that support the community's well-being and their needs. So having infrastructure that supports people's needs is very important, and ensuring that it is sustainable, socially, economically, and also environmentally. So even building, for example, a simple road, when we speak about upgrading infrastructure, it's important to see the bigger picture. So how is that infrastructure going to impact the people that use that road, how it will impact their travel behavior, their activities, their lifestyle choices. So, we really need to see the bigger picture and see how we can develop our urban areas sustainably, but also holistically,
Thank you for that. In fact, related to the first question, we have also a question from a participant, and it reads as follows. How do we create more templates on sustainable design for those interested in creating smart, sustainable homes? How do we make their journey simpler so as to encourage such developments over traditional non-sustainable developments?
Well, the presumption is that we need to produce more homes. And then there is another issue there, which is, what do we need to build? So we need to build houses because we have a growing population, or do we need to build more hotels because we want to get more tourists in? Do we need to build more offices because we need? I think we have to be careful about what we mean when we say, how do we make more sustainable homes? Do we mean more homes first that are sustainable? Or do we look at it from a wider perspective and maybe we say, perhaps we don't need any more hotels, or maybe we don't need so many offices. That is where I think the real sustainability. If we have to build them, as I said before, then we need to look at the materials that we use, okay. Then we need to look at the energy, but especially one of the most interesting things about energy used in the construction industry is that a large chunk of the carbon emissions are not necessarily related to the operation stage of a building, but to the construction stage of a building. And by construction stage, what do I mean? I mean, if you talk about cement, because you need it for concrete, there is an energy embodied in the production of cement. And then there is the energy in transporting cement to Malta, because for us, practically all the building materials are imported. So there's another layer of carbon embedded in the material. And it's very difficult to escape it. Earlier, the minister talked about net zero. So the idea would be that you acknowledge that there is a carbon footprint cost, and then you offset it by doing something else, by generating some energy with renewables and such sort of things, so that you have a balance, which is in theory not a bad idea. But I also am a bit worried about, in practice, what this could become. I think the previous speaker was talking about sustainable transport, and the minister was talking about the electrification of the transport fleet. And that is going to happen, it's going to be pushed at least throughout the whole of Europe. Now, I have nothing against the concept of electrification because you reduce the fumes, but I'm a bit worried that if we think that the electrification of our private vehicles transport fleet will remove the emissions, yes, okay, but it will not remove the congestion. On the contrary, it will keep on promoting congestion, which will then promote more roads, which will promote more underground car parking spaces, which will promote more waste, and so on. It's a whole vicious circuit. So if we think that being sustainable means let's change our car to an electric vehicle because it's cleaner, then we've got it all wrong. The solution should be twofold. Do we need to move around so much? Can we plan that maybe we don't need to move all over the island in order to have our daily lives? And that is something which is already happening in some cities. In Paris, they have introduced the objective of the 15-minute city. In other words, quarters, redesigning the city quarters so that somebody who lives in a quarter has everything that he needs to live a normal daily life within a 15-minute walk, so that you don't need the car. So it's not a question just of changing the type of engine in the car, but changing the need for the car. And then if we have to travel, finding more efficient ways of transport, hence the focus on public transport. So in answer to this question, I'm saying we need to look at the bigger picture. The technologies for making more energy efficient building and recycled building exist, but it won't solve the problem.
Thank you. Ms. Karen, your take on this question?
Yes, I mean, for me, it's the same. I would say even the idea of the 15-minute city that we create, destinations within your locality or nearby localities. I think currently, when you look at the situation right now, the fact is that most things are close by. So they're either within your locality or they're in the periphery of your locality or a nearby locality, and you could get to that place, but the infrastructure present is acting as a barrier for people to actually walk or to cycle to that place. So making it easier for people to walk around their villages and to get to their destinations, I think is very important and is part of creating sustainable urban cities.
Can I add to this that if as Karen said, people invested money in making our streets in the villages and towns more walkable, more pleasant to walk, with better pavements, with shaded, with trees, make walking an experience.
Exactly.
It would have a much better effect, much bigger effect than changing our cars to electricity, in my view, to make a sustainable city. Yeah.
Thank you both. I'll turn again first with you, Karen, for this next question. In your opinion, what are the main characteristics of a sustainable city, or better in Malta's context for the whole island? And what are the biggest hurdles and obstacles that Malta is facing to achieve this?
Yes. So I think a sustainable city, one of the main aspects of it is making people-oriented cities. So it's designing the city to actually meet the needs of the people living in that urban area. So like we said, the walkability and the bikeability of spaces that encourage you to not use your car. And then this ties in with the accessibility to public spaces, to green spaces, to services, so that you don't have to use motorized vehicles, the buildings within those urban spaces, that they need to be green buildings, the materials that are used, green roofs, and also the aesthetic of those buildings. I think Professor Torpiano can comment more on this. But also the community of urban spaces, I think, is important. Creating a strong community that where people can socialize and interact through the creation of spaces is very important. I think we have a lot of unused spaces in our villages that is currently dedicated, to infrastructure for motorized vehicles. And I think when you create spaces where people can actually go to, not just go through, it's how you create more resilient and more sustainable communities. I think that those are also our biggest hurdles then. So, focusing on creating partnerships with the community, with businesses, with organizations like NGOs. I think that discussion right now is like there's a barrier, there's a disconnect.
Thank you.
I agree completely. And I think if you look at, but I frankly, I didn't know that there were 6 main characteristics, but if you think about what the literature says, they always talk about green spaces, parks, energy efficient or solar powered dwellings, and things like rooftop gardens and more pedestrians, etc. There are also other definitions nowadays. When you look at up the literature and ask about sustainable cities, and they will give you a list of cities, Amsterdam and Helsinki, etc., where they are, let's say, combining the use of technology with, to make things better. At least so it's claimed. So there is reference to, I don't know, smart electricity grid, so that the distribution of electricity can be a bit more efficient, or smart water networks, which optimize water distribution, or smart monitoring of waste and of water management, etc., etc., and of course, smart mobility. I've also come across one definition which suggested that, well, one definition which I like is that a sustainable city is an urban center. So it's a place where, Karin said, a place where communities live. The word urban actually means a civilized community, a place where people come together because it's good for their well-being to be together, as compared to being in the wilder rural areas. At least that's how it was conceived, in the past when the first cities were built. But so the idea that the sustainability is an urban center engineered to improve environmental impact through urban planning and management. And one particular definition I came across was one that said sustainable cities require sustainable citizens. which I think means that we need to have a frame of mind which makes sustainable cities, what we call sustainable cities, possible. Otherwise, it won't work. Now, the way I interpret that is that we need to have citizens who are prepared, I think, first and foremost, to consume less. Because if we want to consume everything and very quickly, we are giving less opportunity for the future generations. I know it's a strange concept, but it's a bit like, I have made this analogy before. When we had the recession, the local construction industry struggled to find the opportunities to invest, etc., etc. When the recession was over and there was also a liberalization of the processes, everybody wanted to do this so quickly because they were worried that it would stop soon. It's a bit like being deprived of food, and then when you suddenly have food, you eat as much as possible because you don't know when your next meal is coming. But in so doing, you get indigestion, right? And that is what is happening when we talk about unsustainable development. We are having indigestion. We don't have the time to digest the consumption that we are making. And there are examples abroad that I admire. For example, one of the very interesting islands, states, not an island, is Curaçao, which has a population which is not far away from ours. It does have a major advantage, is that they have a petroleum industry, but I once attended a presentation, and when they were talking about their concerns, first of all, about tourists, about tourism, how tourism was becoming a bit of a problem for them. Remember, this is a country which is bigger than ours, with a population which is similar to ours, but they were worried because their population had reached 500,000 per year, and they were worried that it was too much. And on the contrary, we, on a smaller country, get very upset that we don't have 2 million tourists a year. And then we have to build the hotels for them. And then when the tourist industry drops, we have to see what to do. And because it's going to grow, we have to build even more hotels, so that then we have to fill in 3 million tourists. So in Curaçao, they made a conscious decision, our tourism will not grow. And they also made a conscious decision to say their car population is limited to about 150,000. They will probably increase it in the future, slowly. But what they're trying to say is, we don't really want 500,000 cars. We haven't reached that stage in Malta. And I think if you mention hurdles, I think the biggest hurdle we have is that we somehow feel the need to develop very, very quickly. I think it's the rate of development that is the biggest hurdles that we have in Malta. We must grow very quickly. I think politicians find it very embarrassing if they have to tell us, look, this year we will not have 5% or 6% growth. We will concentrate on 1% or 2%. I don't think they want to tell us that, because probably they will not get elected. But on the contrary, it is actually good economics to grow slowly. And you know, I always use the example of the plant world. If you look at plants, those that grow slowly are stronger and live for longer. Those plants that grow very, very quickly die out very quickly. And I think this is the issue in Malta. I think we have to look at capacity now. Do we really want the tourism industry to grow so much? Do we want our population to grow so much? It was, up to now, we haven't yet started to debate again whether we have too many people coming into Malta. But a few years ago, we increased the population by, I don't know, anything between 70 and 100,000 over a 5 to 7 year period. And that is with respect to a population of 500,000. So it's a big, big change. And, 2 or 3 towns over 5 to 7 years. And that created lots of difficulties for rents, for infrastructure, for transport, traffic, etc., etc. So that is what sustainable means, in my view, pacing yourself. And I think unless we accept this, that we have to make some sacrifices if we want sustainable development, and unless we develop the planning tools to be able to control development. Sustainable development also means control development and not simply a height limitation. So you can build as long as you're not higher than this, but that's not planning and that's not sustainable. What if, in Gozo, they took a decision to raise the maximum building height from 3 floors to 6 floors. But what does it mean? Is it a question of height? Or is it simply saying, or is it also saying that from a population of, I don't know, in Gozo, maybe 35,000, whatever it is, we are now talking about 70,000. So the model is having 70,000 people. And it's not a question of building height, but it's a question of how do we handle the traffic generated? How do we handle the water resources? How do we handle the power requirements? So what I'm trying to say is that it's very easy to focus on houses and green roofs and green walls, but we lose the whole picture. And in Malta, I don't think we are getting, we're not allowing ourselves to look at the whole picture. Perhaps because it is unpopular to say, okay, let's not have any more of these. In the past, we used to have, I think we still have, numerous clauses on pharmacies. You couldn't have pharmacies more than a certain distance away from each other. A few years ago, there was a big debate on whether we should do something similar for petrol stations. But perhaps we should also do something similar for hotels, for example. We have transformed all of Valletta to the better, but perhaps now we're exaggerating. Should every other house be a boutique hotel? Is that sustainable? Does that represent the Valletta that the tourists want to see? Or is it becoming simply a tourism place? Not where people live and tourists come to visit, but a place simply for tourists. I think that is what is the biggest hurdle. I think we have to realize that there is growth, which doesn't simply mean a higher GDP. I have not yet made that. I have not yet accepted that.
Thank you both. One last question, because we're running out of time, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my answer is a bit long.
Not at all. So we have quite an interesting question from one participant. At the current rate of climate change, do you feel that building standards should be changing to be fit for the climate to come rather than the climate of today?
I think Professor Sorpiano would be best.
Well, I can say something very, very quick. I mean, I'm very concerned about climate change, but I think we need to have a bit of a realistic view on climate change. Climate change is going to happen. Frankly, if Malta and Gozo became carbon neutral, if the whole of Europe became carbon neutral, climate change is going to happen anyway, unless China and India and Africa and the United States subscribes to this. So whilst I'm not saying let's not care, I would prefer to see a bit of more focus on climate mitigation. What is going to happen when climate changes? What is going to happen to our agriculture? What is going to happen with seawater levels, and how will they affect our coastal villages, our coastal towns? What will happen to our tourism industry if we will have these extremes of temperature in summer? I mean, people are talking about desertification. So how are we preparing? And I would rather have the debate on climate change, in Malta at least, focus on mitigation, what we're going to do when climate change hits us. Because I don't think we can change climate change, or certainly not Malta on its own, and not even if we do our best efforts. We still need to mitigate the climate, which is going to hit us.
So with that said, we have come to an end to our discussion on this topic. Thank you both for your interesting take on this and for joining us despite your busy schedule. So now I give the floor to Kat.
Thank you very much. It's all been incredibly interesting. And I'm so glad that everyone could join us this afternoon. On the panel for pollinators, we have Professor David Massoud, who is an associate professor at the Institute of Earth Systems at the University of Malta, operating within the Division for Rural Sciences and Food Systems. He also serves as a director at the Center for the Liberal Arts and Sciences. We also have Dr. Balzan, who is a senior lecturer at the Malta College of Arts, Science and Technology, and the coordinator for the Horizon 2020 project Renature, which promotes research and innovation in nature-based solutions in Malta and the Mediterranean region. So, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Kate. Kate, can you make me visible?
Of course. I'm sorry.
Because I cannot do it from here. Oh, yeah.
So
I think, if I may, I think Professor Masoud, you might have to do it. I don't think we can do it for you from here.
I have mute, pin, hide, video, hide self, rename, choose virtual background. No.
There's at the bottom left, you have mute and stop video. So
At
pause.
the bottom left.
Yes.
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 very nice to see you.
I couldn't see it. Very nice to see you all. Very interesting discussions. Very well done.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Mario.
Hi, David. Colosseum.
So I will start off our panel by asking you, pollinators has become a bit of a buzzword in the last few years. Why exactly are they so important? What is at risk if pollinators continue to decline?
Go ahead, Mario.
Okay, well, thank you, David. Well, let me just explain maybe what pollinators are, which are the different groups of pollinators. I think we have to start from there, because as you're saying, we often use the word pollinators and it's often used as a buzzword. So what are pollinators? Well, I think we're all familiar with the honeybee, which is a very important species. We also have the luck, I would say, of having an endemic subspecies, Apis mellifera rutineri, which I believe David, Professor Masoud will talk about later on as well. But we have a range of pollinators. So bees, we don't know, probably many in this call would not know that we have we have more than 100 species of bees in Malta. I often mention this to my students, and they are all in awe, because that's just bees. And then we're talking about the butterflies, we're talking about the many different species of flies, for example, of hoverflies. We're talking about the moths, important for night pollination, for example, many species of beetles, thrips, and sometimes as well, and so on. So there are many different species of insects. That's only the insects, because there are also other species which are not insects and they're pollinators. So that's pollinators, and I would say pollination, which is the transport of the pollen from the male flower to the female flower, and it's important for us, for everyone, because it gives us a wide range of fruits and a large amount of our fruit and veggies. And I will mention this a bit later on. It's important for us. You know, the annual value of pollination of crops goes above $235 billion per year. Okay, and the maximum estimated is nearly 600 billion. So we're talking about a large amount of money. And 87.5% of flowering plants, so not just the crops. You know, if you're walking outside in the landscape, nice landscape with a lot of flowers, around 90% of those flowers are dependent on pollination, biotic pollination. So by insects, by living organisms. So I think the first thing we have to do is start with these numbers and explain what is the importance of pollinators. Of course, then the question, I think, is what's at risk if you lose pollinators? But all of this is at risk. You could lose biotic pollination of crops. And to be more specific now, for Malta, we did a paper in 2018 where we valued the pollination of crops, how much valuable it is. And that the estimate was 8.2 million euros per year. So pollinators contribute to the Maltese economy 8.2 million euros per year,
in terms of crop pollination, which is just 18.18% of the annual crop production in Malta, which is significant. We also have data which shows that this value is increasing with time. So I think this gives a very good overview of why we need pollinators and why we should be concerned about their loss, basically. I'll leave it up to you, David, if you want to add.
Thank you very much, Dr. Balzan. Do you have?
No. It was perfectly explained by Mario.
Okay.
I mean, very few people know that even though Malta is a very small country, we have all these different things, you know. I mean, in terms of insects, we have more than 5,000 different species of insects, you know. So, I mean, people would never realize that we have 1,000 different flies, you know. We have almost 2,000 beetles, you know. We have 600 moths, which Mario mentioned, you know. And a good number of all these insects are actually pollinators, you know. So this is very important, very important.
Of course, because of our small size, you would underestimate.
Yes.
How many different species we have. What do we know about the current status of pollinators? How bad is it looking? Not just in Malta, but globally.
Well, let's look a bit about Malta, I would say, don't forget that, as Mario mentioned, one of the most important insects used worldwide for pollination are the honeybees, you know. In Europe, this honeybee has evolved in a number of subspecies. So in Europe, we have around 14 different subspecies. So a subspecies is a community of these bees. They have been there for many thousands of years, and they have evolved to that particular climate. This is also the case for Malta. And so in various parts of Europe, we find different subspecies. In Malta, we are blessed to have our own subspecies. It was described some 20 years ago, Apis mellifera rotneri. And from experiments we have been doing, we found out that this particular subspecies is highly adapted to our islands. You know, when we have been doing experiments trying to compare what this bee can do vis-a-vis what the Italian bee can do, this can do much better, you know, much better. So this is also one important aspect that people and beekeepers need to bear in mind, is that let's try to promote what we have. Let's try that each country in Europe promotes its own subspecies, you know. So this is the most important organism which pollinates most of our agricultural crops, you know. As Mario mentioned, you know, there are many more insects which are used in pollination. Important papers nowadays, Mario, here you can correct me if I'm saying something wrong, is that very often where you have bee populations, you know, so honeybees, very often the number of the other pollinators in that particular area will rather diminish, you know, because honeybees tend to overcome that particular territory. So there are a number of studies nowadays about this, let's call it conflict, you know. So this is also something that's there, you know, in the environment, you know. But otherwise, this pollination, I mean the insect. I mean, I very often I try to explain to my students, you know, always try to put yourself inside the mind of the insect. You know, the insect doesn't know what he is doing. The insect doesn't know that he is pollinating the thing. The insect is only attracted to the flower because this flower has very nice flowers, you know, has very nice colors. The petals are large enough, you know. The flower also have glands at the base. These are called nectaries. And these nectaries are full of nectar. You know, nectar is essentially water and sugar, you know. Now, there are some flowers where this nectar solution is higher in sugars. There are other flowers which is less in sugars. And obviously, these organisms that pollinate these flowers are actually attracted to the flower, and more than that, they are attracted to this nectar, you know, to this sugary solution. So they are going there to take this rich resource, you know, and then so doing, without knowing, they are also pollinating these plants, you know. So pollination is a big subject that probably me and Mario can talk about it for probably weeks, you know, not only half an hour.
Do it. No, I think I can only add a few things about the biodiversity aspect of it. So there were many studies, as David was mentioning, about the status of pollinators in Europe. So at European scale, I think there's many studies. And I think, for example, there are studies which show that for butterflies, we've lost, I think since the 90s, around 40% of the abundance of butterfly studies in grasslands, for example, in Europe. So we don't have this data, I think, for Malta. And there were studies also, for example, for bees. We know that 1 out of 10 species is threatened with extinction in Europe. That's not, I mean, 1 out of 10 means we still have 9. But in reality, out of those 9, 6, we don't know their status. So what remains is around 3 to 4%. So sorry, 30 to 40%, which we have assessed and which are not in a threatened status. So the situation, I think, is not so good in the sense that it's good if you would sort of consider as normal to lose 1 out of 10 species, but in fact we seem to be losing these species. We don't know about many species. So how bad is the situation? Well, the answer is, for some species, for the honeybee, we know a lot because there are many people studying honeybees in Europe, and also because we have many beekeepers, so they have an interest in the subject, a keen interest in the subject. Luckily. But for many pollinators, we don't know. We don't know their status except for the most studied species. The threats are various. We now know that the competition, for example, between species like with the honeybee, which is a social insect, and therefore if we put ourselves in the brain of a honeybee, you know what honeybees do? Actually, they have species which go and forage and find the resource, and then they might take other colleagues, other sisters to this resource, right? So, and one hive would contain very large numbers. I don't know, David, 50,000 individuals?
50,000 to 90,000, yes.
So that's a large amount of honeybees. On the other hand, I have to explain that many, for example, insects, like bees, for example, are solitary. So this would mean that one female would have its own nest. So there isn't this communication aspect, and this is why there is this potential competition between honeybees and wild bees and wild pollinators, which could be a threat. We know in some countries it has been shown to be a major threat. In some other countries, well, there's studies which show that it is not a threat. In Malta, I think there isn't yet a published study, but I can say that we have some data about this, and our data confirms that there is competition, and this should be published in the next few weeks or months. You don't know, never know, but we have data about this, and we are aware of this competition between species. But yes, we don't know in many cases. I think we need to do more to this extent to understand the threats to pollinators locally, and also the status and how this is changing with time.
Mario mentioned butterflies, you know, I mean, this is a case in point, you know, even for Malta. I mean, up to 30 years ago, you used to see butterflies all over, you know, we had 24 different species of butterflies. Nowadays, you only see 2 butterflies, you know, the common cabbage white butterfly, and sometimes you see the swallowtail. Otherwise, you don't see nothing, you know. I remember 30 years ago, wherever we used to go in the valleys, you know, walking, we used to have hundreds of butterflies, all of them flying together. Now you see nothing. And this is not only in Malta, many people in Europe, in France, etc., say exactly the same thing. So this is of concern. This is of big concern, you know.
Of course. And I mean, you said some 30 years ago, I'm nearing 25, but both living in the UK and in Belgium and in Malta, I can say that even walking in the countryside, I've hardly ever seen butterflies while walking.
Yes.
I mean, few insects,
sad.
but especially very, very few butterflies.
Yes, yeah, this is so sad. This is so sad, you know.
Of course. And talking a little bit about threats, can you tell me a few main threats that pollinators face? And adding on to that question, we know by now that climate change has caused and will continue to cause a range of negative impacts on the planet. How does climate change affect pollinators?
Ooh, these are big questions.
In summary.
Threats, listen, I mean, let's talk about Malta. You know, threats in Malta, I would say that we have two main threats over here, but this is not only for pollinators, it's for all living organisms out there, you know. All this habitat destruction, all this construction work, and more agricultural use, you know, in land. This is all a threat to the to all these indigenous species, many of which are pollinators. So this is a big threat. Another big threat, which many people don't very often look at it as a threat, is the accidental introduction of alien species. So when you have a territory like Malta, you can have insects or other organisms coming in with agricultural products, with flowers, with cut flowers, whatever, with trade, you know. And sometimes these can find a suitable environment in their new territory. And if so, they can adapt to this environment. And if so, they can start multiplying. They have no natural enemies, and they become invasive to that particular territory. So very often we talk about alien invasive species. And these, very often, they are the second most important thing in threats to local biodiversity, including pollinators. At the moment, we have an EU project, it's called FAST, and we are trying to address some of these aspects related to alien species, you know. So this is a big threat. Mario, I'm pretty sure that he will talk about many other threats. I have very little data about climate change, so probably Mario can talk more about it. But people, let's not pinpoint our finger to only climate change, you know, as also Torpiano was saying beforehand, you know. I think that there are many things which are contributing to this loss in biodiversity, you know. So it's not just climate change, you know. Very often, immediately when you talk to a scientist, he will tell you it's because of climate change. Many data, we don't know it, you know. So it's easier said than done, you know. It's easier to pinpoint your finger to something, but very often it is a complex thing, you know, and you have to see it in a more holistic way, you know, in a more holistic way. Mario, I give you the floor.
Thank you, David. I agree with you on all you said. I think it also what you are saying, I think calls for more investment in nature, in our biodiversity, because we take a lot of things for granted. I mean, I think we can talk about honeybees, for example, right? It's not one factor which affects their health. So here we're not talking about biodiversity, it's just one species. We can talk about the loss of the resources, of the habitat. So when we have urbanization, we have been having massive urbanization locally, I think, in the past decade or so. I've been listening to the previous discussion as well, and this ties in. This ties in. I think everything ties in, and we need to not talk about insects or pollinators separately from other subjects. I think this is a mistake we often do, and I think that if you think about, let me explain this. Think about honeybees. We lose habitat, so they lose food. There is the problem of alien species. Think about, for example, Oxalis pescapre, الحشرة الإنجليزية, David. Which has replaced a large amount of our vegetation. You know, that's food resources for pollinators. So you have urbanization, habitat loss, alien species replacing valuable habitat and valuable resources for our pollinators.
Also,
at the same
Varroa,
time,
Mario, you can mention Varroa also.
You can mention Varroa for honeybees, which maybe if someone who don't knows, this is like a mite which actually feeds on honeybees. You have the impact of use of pesticides, and all of these things act together. You have climate change. I haven't mentioned climate change, which is a massive thing. I mean, we cannot forget about climate change. We've been having, I don't know, 3 months without any good rain, or 2 months without any, I don't have the data, but it's a lot. That changes landscapes. So what happens then? All of these factors interact. So we often think about specific factors and climate change on its own, but it's not like that with biodiversity, with nature. It's all these factors interacting in synergy, and that impacts, in this case, on honeybee health. And I am sure that will interacts also for many species. So that results eventually in the loss of our pollinators, as we were discussing before, and not because of a single factor. It's these things combined. If you talk about climate change, there's changes in the phenology of the relationship between plants and pollinators. So a plant may flower earlier, and that would mean that its pollinator is not there. So that would mean that its reproductive cycle is affected. If it's a crop, it would mean that you have a reduction in crop production, therefore impacting on the productivity and the profit that the farmer eventually makes. So it's all builds
and
on everything builds on each other, you know, and everything is interacting. And I think we need to invest more in nature, not just in understanding nature or protecting nature, but actually, you know, actually collecting the data, which is not there at the moment. So many questions. We know what's happening in Europe, globally, to some extent even locally, but I think we need to do more. I think Malta should be doing more on this subject, because we are losing biodiversity, and we probably don't know that we are losing biodiversity. So
that actually leads me beautifully into my next question, which is, do you think enough is being done at an EU level to safeguard pollinator populations? And how do you think Malta fares on the EU Pollinators Initiative, which aims to tackle the decline of wild pollinators?
This question is for you, Mario.
I'm sorry.
No, I think at European scale, well, I'm a big pro Europe science work, because I see a lot of stuff happening. Maybe I think David will agree with me. There's a lot of things happening at international scale, and often very big research teams and very big communities working together. And I think this is really, really good. The EU Pollinators Initiative, I think, because I have been involved in with this international scientific community for some time, I think we can safely say it's a consequence of what has happened in science. So I remember in 2012, I was in Belgium with a company that does innovation for crop protection. And at the same time, there were a lot of studies being published in Science, the journal Science and Nature. These are the top journals globally, showing the impact of a group of pesticides, neonicotinoids, on the honeybee.
Yeah.
And then after that, so at first it was the honeybee, because as we said before, we know a lot about honeybees, and there's a lot of interest in these, and there's a whole community behind honeybees. And then we started to discover not just honeybees, it's also bumblebees. It's also butterflies. These pesticides also stay in the soil, also go in the water, and they stay there for a long time. And I think the building on that and what has happened, the international scientific community really did some excellent research and some excellent science. And this, I think, convinced policymakers. There was a lot of interaction between science and policy. And this, I think, at European scale is one very nice example of how science can influence policy. And eventually, we now have the EU Pollinators Initiative, which I think is a milestone. But we going from here to change actually on the ground, actual change in the ground in the member states like Malta is another thing. So I think there is a lot that has to be done there. I enjoy research. I'm involved in research also, which monitors pollinators as part of projects. And I think that one thing I would say is that Malta should be doing more in terms of investment in research for this topic, because this is essentially a research topic. Our research performance is not good. So 0.7% of the GDP is dedicated to research. That has been like this for years, for I think a decade. It goes up sometimes and then it goes a bit down. So I think we need to invest in research, not just in the most topics which are most fancy at the moment, you know, but also this biodiversity, this natural capital aspect. Otherwise, really, we cannot get to know more about biodiversity and the trends and what is happening. I think we should be doing more. We should be building capacity by linking what is happening in university with MCAST, with the authorities. I think there's a lot of fragmentation out there, which is keeping us behind. That is my opinion. And much more needs to be done.
Yes, definitely much more needs to be done, people. This is something, I mean, for example, biodiversity. This is also a very interesting concept. Everyone wants to say this word, you know, but we don't know exactly what we have out there in our little environment that we still have. So in Europe, it is well documented. There are catalogs and everything, you know, about about all organisms. In Malta, we have next to nothing, you know, we have next to nothing. 11 years ago, I started to publish and to put people together. Mario is one of the authors, a bulletin of entomology. So I started to put people together from various parts of Europe and the Maltese scientists to study the biodiversity with respect to insects of Malta, you know. And in 11 years, we gave information on more than 1,400 different species of insects that live in Malta. But there are many, many more, much more than that, you know. And out of this number, about 500 species were never previously reported for Malta. Not because these are alien species. These are species that have always been here. They are indigenous, but no one ever dared to study them. So this is bad, you know. This is really bad, you know. I mean, I have students working their masters and PhD with me on groups of insects that we know nothing about them. So little by little, there is a change, you know, but this change is so slow, and the environment out there is being removed at a much faster rate than people are studying the insects in this environment. So there is definitely something wrong, you know. And also, whereas 10 years ago, we would have 3, 4 people, 5 people, students interested to study biodiversity and what's out there. Nowadays, we only find 1 or 2 students every 5 years who are really interested in such studies, you know. So taxonomists, for example, people who actually look and try to identify what this insect is, they are dying. It's a dying generation, you know. And this is I would say this is very serious, you know. I mean, because in 50 years time, we will have big problems if this trend continues.
Thank you very much.
Katrina, maybe I can say something, because this is
Of course.
feels a bit sad. But what David is saying is actually true. But not all is bad in the sense, and the EU Pollinators initiative should be taken in that vein. You know, I mean, not everything is finished. I mean, not everything is so bad, because this is actually meant to help us, you know, monitor what's going on and actually help us come up with management that is based on what is happening, you know, the evidence-based management. And there are other things like the Green Deal, for example. I think it's all about investment.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are not prioritizing the sector because it is seen as not a main contributor to gross domestic product, to our economy, but it's not like that. I've been hearing the discussion before this chat, and really, I mean, it's, if you think about tourism, for example, you know, people come here to go for a walk in the countryside, to enjoy the beaches, to enjoy the landscape, and there's that as well. you know, and this is also because of pollinators. So, and the link you may seem indirect, but it's not, because, for example, we have data from our students. My students are sort of more applied and working across the ecological to society part, you know, and we've asked, for example, tourists, what do they think about our landscapes, and what if they would like to come back, for example. What happens if Malta embarks on a green sort of greening of the landscapes, you know? And we know that, for example, most of the tourists would, in a scenario where Malta becomes more urbanized, would not come back. In a scenario where Malta becomes more, let's say, greener, a larger amount of tourists at least will come back. So there is this aspect. There is a link to the economy, but we don't make that link that obviously. And I think unless we invest in understanding these links, then something will always remain limiting. We cannot, I think we have to think about the system as a social, but also ecological system, you know, because we are linked to nature, and unfortunately we are losing that link. If you think about the landscapes, how they've been managed in history in Malta, I mean, over the 7,000 or 8,000 years of history, there has always been this link between human and the ecology. But now we're living in cities which are denser, which are more technological. And this is the point. With the Green Deal, with such initiatives, I think there is now a trend towards greening our economy. And that has to lead to building the regeneration of our connection with nature. So there are many opportunities there, I think, also from an economic point of view, from a societal aspect, you know, the health of people, mental health, and so on, which I think we are missing at the moment. And this is a turning point, I think. I hope that with the COVID situation, the Russian invasion recently, and the focus on the Green Deal and what has happened after that, I think Malta and also the other European countries can actually focus on restoring biodiversity, including pollinators.
So we've talked a bit at length about problems, and we've mentioned a little bit about solutions. And I'd like us to end on a somewhat more positive note. So considering it is the European Year of Youth, and on 20th May, there is World Bee Day, how can we as citizens, especially as youth, help? And what conservation techniques and mitigation tactics would you recommend?
I mean, there are so many things that you as youths can do, you know, to have the environment out there, you know. You have to voice all these concerns, you know. There are so many initiatives that you can do for bees, you know. For example, I mean, this even agricultural land, you know. So you leave an outer perimeter, you know, with wildflowers, you know, not just, you know, barley, you know. I mean, an outer parameter so that there are wildflower for bees, you know. But even in houses, you know, in roundabouts, wherever on the roads, you know. I mean, we should start planting plants which are good for bees, you know. We are still planting things which has nothing to do with bees, you know, etc., etc. Also, very important, now there is a change, you know, some local councils have adhered to this, but very often during this time of the year, all the grasses, what we call in Maltese hashish hazin, which is not really bad grass, you know, these are all in flowers, you know. And you see many of the local councils going there, you know, and remove all this from pavements, from nearby roads, etc. You know, this is all bad practice, you know. We should always think, if I am the honeybee, what would I need? I would need all these flowers everywhere, you know. So you shouldn't remove them. We are a very small country, so we cannot afford to remove all this, you know. So you should voice you should voice all this, you know. Plant flowers which are good for bees. Go out there, you know, tell the people, educate the younger generations, you know. So very often, you know, I'm always asked to go to primary schools and talk to children. Even though I am a very busy person, I always go to talk to these people, you know. I always go to talk to to these small boys and girls, 7, 8, 9 years old. I take collections with me. I tell them what the honeybees do, you know, I tell them what pollinators do. And there is a change, people. I'm pretty sure that many of these young children, they are fascinated on the topics, you know, when we talk to them. So I'm pretty sure that in 10 years' time, they will remember what we have been talking to them, and they will make a change, you know. Hopefully they will be the minister of environment in 20, 30 years' time, you know, and then he would know what is really needed for this country.
Thank you very much, Professor Mafsoud. Dr. Balzan, can you add anything?
I think, well, it's hard to add anything to that, but I think we can say that, is it acceptable to lose our pollinators? Is it acceptable to lose our biodiversity? And I think youth have always played this role of being a strong voice in history. I think many things have happened because of youth. We are also now, as I was saying before, moving towards a greener society. And I think youth have a sort of a role to play, you know, in keeping decision makers to what they are promising on paper, you know, because we are talking a lot of time about green cities, you know, green roofs, green walls. We have to ask, and then we have press releases about green walls, how effective they are for pollinators, and the same for green roofs, and the same for afforestation projects. But I think youth and the civil society, really with youth as well, has to ask, is this money worth spending in these things? Are they actually leading to positive action? Are they leading to improved biodiversity conservation? Are we saving our pollinators? Or the situation after we invest €1 million on this project and another €1 million on that project will remain exactly the same? I think you, me, everyone, us, me, David, scientists, but really everyone has to ask these questions. We are investing in nature, but are we effective? And we have to keep the people who are taking decisions, I think, to their promise. You know, this is what you're saying on paper. Now we have to do this, and to do this, we need to carry out certain actions and ensure that these actions are effective. So I think youth can play a very important role in promoting and supporting and vouching for this change. And I hope we all do that, because that would be great.
And keeping policymakers accountable at the end of the day.
Sure.
I think that's very important. Not just policymakers. It's easy to spend money, you know. It's because the money tends to be there. But the problem is it really leading to what we should be achieving? If we say there is a policy which means that there is no biodiversity loss by 2030, there are such policies, you know, are we reaching that target? Are we approaching that target, and were we still in the same place? Or we don't know, maybe if we're in the same place or we're improving. So I think I think civil society has a role to play in asking these questions. And youth, because of the interest in nature and also in greening our society, I think can take a leading role.
Thank you very, very much for your contribution today. That brings us to an end of our pollinators panel. And I'd like to say a very big thank you once again to all of our speakers and all of our guests for joining us for what has been our first event. I'd also like to remind everyone that this has been recorded and it will be made available on our LinkedIn page in a few days. And some screenshots have been taken of the event, which will also be shared with the European Commission, since this has been part of their Green Track campaign, which leads to COP15 in China later this year. And should any of the youth and anyone who has joined us today be inspired by anything that we've talked about today, please feel free to contact us and get involved with YES-Europe. We would be very glad to have you on board. Thank you very much.
And you can follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram. I left the links in the emails that I sent you all. We are YES-Europe Malta on both LinkedIn and Instagram. And also we have a website as well, which you can find all of our emails.
Thank you very much.